First of all, we're going to remove the brisket. To remove the brisket, just going to run my knife down through the meat, pressing hard against the rib bones, and then get the saw and start to slice through the bones. Then turn it round to finish off the remaining rib bones. Careful not to cut through to the bowler. Flip the brisket over and find that seam in between the brisket and the bowler blade there. Gently slicing through, and there is your brisket. To bone out the brisket, the first step is to remove the inside skirt. This is done by just gently following along the meat there. Then pull off the membrane off either side of the skirt. And do a little bit of trick. Get my knife, follow closely around the edge of the brisket bone, cutting away from myself, like so. Stand the brisket up and slide my knife in between the rib meats and the rib. Removing that meat and keeping my knife hard against the bone. And there we have a boneless brisket. Now that I've removed the brisket bone, I'm going to show you how you can get your point end and your navel end brisket. First of all, we must remove the decal. This is quite easy. All I have to do is find that little bit of fat down there in between the meat and the decal, get that seam, and making my way up to the 6th rib, and then making an incision all the way through, removing the navel end from the point end of brisket. And now we're going to show you how to make a rolled brisket. To do this, we've got to do a little bit of trimming. We've got to take a little bit of this fat from the inside and the outside. And remove a little bit more of the fat from the midsection of the point. Try and make your brisket as flat as possible so you can get a nice even roll when you roll it up. I've trimmed off all the fat ready for rolling. Try and distribute the meat evenly through the whole brisket so you get a nice even roll. Now all I have to do is get some pins, just gently put them through the top, bring it round so you make a nice tight little roll. All ready to be stitched. Turn the brisket around facing you, get your string and a needle. Pushing your needle all the way through, roughly about halfway through the brisket, and then back through again a second time, keeping your string all in line. Do the old trusty butcher's knot, pull it tight. I've just finished stitching. All I have to do now, remove the pins and trim up the ends. A beautiful rolled brisket. To remove the chuck, you must locate the area between the 4th and 5th rib, marking that with your knife. Then with the handsaw, slice through the vertebrae between that 4th and 5th rib. Now that we've cut through the bone, slice halfway through, hitting the bowler blade at the outer edge of the carcass. Then locate the seam between the chuck and the blade with your knife. You'll be able to gently pull that away a bit. Once you've been able to open that up a bit, using your hip, just slice through the membrane, releasing the chuck. Then from the top point end there, slice around the bowler, removing the chuck. To bone out the chuck, this process is a little bit more difficult. To start with, I have to run my knife around the hills and valleys on either side of the chuck bone. You'll find there's a lot of little ridges as you follow the bone along. We've removed one side, then gently, carefully run your knife around the other side of the neck bone. Turn the chuck around. Then run your knife between the chuck and the feather bone to release the meat from that area. Once you've marked all the way around the neck bones, roll the chuck over, then holding your knife hard against the rib bones, slice through, removing the meat. Once you've removed the meat off the rib bones, roll the chuck over, then following the contours of the neck bone, remove the meat. This section of the neck has a lot of hills and valleys as well. Just following up and down. Finally, removing the bone. There's your boneless chuck. The chuck is the most difficult primal to bone out, and the mark of good butchery is to remove as much meat as possible. All I have to do now is remove the paddywhack then square up the sides of the chuck, removing any excess meat. And that will give. This is the blade section of the carcass. Now I'm going to show you how to remove it. Underneath that bottom rib, I'll just cut straight through the meat, get my handsaw, cutting through the blade bone, all ready for bone. And here we have the whole blade. What I'm going to do for you now is show you how to take the foreshank off and produce the gravy beef. First of all, I followed the contour of that bone along until I hit the cup joint where the bowler blade is situated and the foreshank is situated. I'll open that up with my knife and have to spin it around just a little bit, just on the edge of your block, to break that little bit of a sinew there. Then carefully cut around the bone to produce your foreshank. To remove the gravy beef, carefully follow the contour of the bone. spin the bone around so you can get a better angle at the other side. There we have our gravy beef off the bone. To slice the gravy beef up, just trim the ends and slice to your required thickness, ready for dicing. Here I have the remainder of the bowler. Now all I have to do is remove the bone, cut along that bone there, around, through between the scapular bone, releasing the meat from the bone as I go. Then we have to turn the bowler around and repeat the process. And there we have your semi-boneless bowler blade. To produce the rest of the cuts from the blade, firstly I have to remove the piece of silver skin located on top of the undercut. I remove the undercut off the scapular bone. Careful to follow that seam all the way to the edge. To remove the chuck tender and the bowler from the scapular bone, I just mark either side of the scapular bone. Careful not to dig too deep in there. Around the front of the blade and turn him over. Feel for the ridge. That ridge we've got to mark down either side. That's a bone there on the scapular bone. And there we have our chuck. Now it's just a matter of just removing that little bit of fat and selvage from the chuck tender. And there we have a lovely lean piece of beef. To remove the scapular bone, all we have to do is mark down the opposite side of that ridged bone from the chuck tender, turn the bowler over again, and there we have the scapular bone. And that's what we're looking for, a nice lean piece of beef, the oyster blade and the bowler. What I want to do now is separate these two primals. So finding the very edge of that oyster blade there, I'll just get my knife and slice straight through, following that seam. There we have our two primals, our oyster blade and our... To get a blade steak, first all I have to do is remove any excess fat off the top, turn it over, any excess underneath. The grain runs this way across the primal, so therefore we must slice across the grain, shortening up the meat fibres to make sure we end up with a nice tender steak. Here we have the oyster blade. What I'm going to do with the oyster blade today is make two flat iron steaks. First of all, we must remove any silver skin or cartilage off the underside. Just slide your knife underneath the cartilage there, removing as much of that silver skin as possible, and any excess meat on the side must be removed. Turn it over, remove any excess fat. All the fat must come off. And then sliding your knife underneath that silver skin, remove all of that. Then, once we've trimmed all the excess fat and sinew off the outside, we must remove that cartilage from the centre of the steak. Start off by just gently running your knife along that first thick part of the oyster blade, trying not to leave too much meat on the sinew. You'll see there we've picked up that nice little cartilage. It's just a matter of running your knife carefully along to remove it. There we have one flat iron steak. Then we repeat the process by turning it over and removing the remainder of that sinew from the flat iron. Any excess that we've missed, just trim up accordingly. Square up your ends, and there you have two beautiful flat iron steaks. This is the set of ribs, and here is the Scotch fillet. Out of the set of ribs, I'm now going to show you how to make a tomahawk steak, a ribeye on the bone. Find your short ribs, make a standing rib roast, but first I have to remove the chine bone and then the feather bone. To remove the feather bone, I run my knife hard against it, releasing the meat. Stand the set of ribs up on its end, line the chine bone up with the bandsaw blade and gently push it through. First the tomahawk, hold your knife hard against the second rib and slice all the way down. And there's the tomahawk steak. Next, the short ribs, and I'll cut these 75mm out from the eye of the Scotch fillet. Push gently through the bandsaw. Next, I'm going to remove the cap from the rib set following the seam. Then follow along the edge of the Scotch fillet, removing the meat. And the intercostals. And there's your French standing rib roast. From the standing rib, I can also cut a ribeye on the bone. To remove the Scotch